Biblical Economics Today, Volume 19, Number 6, by Gary North, October-November 1997. Ron Sider has moved in the right direction. We are all familiar with the student who goes off to college and comes home after the first year spouting liberal nonsense that he learned in the classroom. This phenomenon has been around since the days of classical Greece. Aristophanes wrote a comedy about such a youth, Clouds. A young man goes off to Socrates' academy and comes home a know-it-all jerk. Students usually go over this phase by age 30, unless they go to graduate school. In grad school, the damage done to both common and moral sense can become permanent. The Christian version is the youth who comes home spouting nonsense and quoting the Bible out of context to defend his views. He does things like quote Israel's Jubilee law, Leviticus 25, as a model of state-directed wealth redistribution. No one told him that the Jubilee's legal basis was genocide, the destruction of an entire civilization by the Israelites, that is, wealth distribution by military conquest. No one told him that the same Jubilee law authorized the permanent enslavement of foreigners and their children, Leviticus 25, verse 44-46. He insists that he is still a Christian, yet he declares that a Christian can be a liberal, an in-your-face, in-your-wallet, tax collector's gun-in-your-belly kind of liberal. He now says in so many words, you'll have to pay. Government gets to spend the money on the poor, after skimming off 50% for handling, and it's all in the name of Jesus. With the publication of Rich Christians in Age of Hunger, a biblical study, in 1977, Ronald J. Sider became the Moses of the American Protestant evangelical version of this kind of liberal. John R. Stott had already begun serving this role in England. Sider led them in a unique kind of exodus out of the fundamentalist prayer closets of their youth. Free at last, dressed in tweed jackets with the obligatory leather patches on the elbows, an army of Christian college and seminary professors followed him into the wilderness of liberation theology. They thought they were on the cutting edge of a new, caring kind of Christianity. They imagined that they were headed into the promised land of social relevance and political influence. They believed that their students would follow him. The students did, too, for about 3 years. Then they changed their minds, voted for Ronald Reagan, and went into real estate development or the brokerage business. This, too, shall pass, but that is another story. Now, 2 decades later, their leader has announced it was all a big mistake. Ron Sider has become a card-carrying capitalist. In mid-1997, the 20th anniversary edition of Ron Sider's Rich Christians in Age of Hunger appeared. On the cover, it proclaims over 350,000 copies in print. Most of these copies were the first edition. The second edition was forced on Sider in 1984 by David Chilton's book, Productive Christians in an Age of Guilt Manipulators, 1981, which I hired Chilton to write and which ICE published. Sider prudently refused to mention Chilton in that second edition. Also in the third edition and the latest edition, the original publishers surrendered control over it in 1990 when Ward Books picked it up. Publishers do not surrender books that are still selling well. In a Christianity Today interview published in the same issue as an obituary for David Chilton, April 28, 1997, Sider made it clear that he no longer is of the same opinion as he had been in 1977. The times have changed, and so have I, page 68. Furthermore, I admit, though, that I didn't know a great deal of economics when I read the first edition of Rich Christians, page 68-69, or he could accurately have added the second and third editions. It is clear who his nemesis had been since 1981, the unnamed David Chilton. Quote, I had no interest in trying to psychologically manipulate people into some kind of false guilt, unquote, page 68. No, indeed, he wanted to manipulate them based on their true guilt. This is what his book was all about. But then came the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Times have changed, and so has he. Better put, the New York Times has changed, and so has he. He read the headlines in the Times, and he saw the light. He counted all those who were still officially in favor of socialism, and he saw the light. It was not David Chilton's arguments that persuaded him. It was a shift in liberalism's climate of opinion, and therefore academic neo-evangelicalism's opinions. The original version of Rich Christians was a track for the times. They were rotten times, ideologically speaking. The economic debate, as far as Christian intellectuals knew, was between Keynesians and Marxists. Not today. Everything has changed. Marxism is dead. Keynesianism is in its terminal stages, taking tiny, halting steps like an octogenarian with a walker. Sider has recognized this, and he turned back toward what he used to call Egypt. No, the promised land lies in this direction. Most of this army turned back in the 1980s, and they have brought up all the choice real estate. Only Sider's officer corps, still dressed in the same tweed jackets, remains with him. Will they keep following him, or will they continue to wander in circles? Were it not for the manna of academic tenure, they would have died of starvation 2 decades ago. Revisions. Cider begins his revised edition with this admission, quote, "My thinking has changed. I've learned more about economics." Page 13. So have his former readers. Socialist radicalism has fallen out of favor all over the world. The climate of opinion in the liberal media changed in 1991. Ron Cider has changed right along with it. I think of Joe Sobran's warning. He would rather be in a church that has not changed its beliefs in 5,000 years than one that spends its days huffing and puffing to catch up with the latest shift in media opinion. The 20th edition is barely recognizable. It even has a new subtitle, Moving from Affluence to Generosity. The earlier editions had been subtitled A Biblical Study. The new subtitle is less pretentious. It also sounds more private than status, which reflects the book's perspective. Here's an example of how much the book has changed. You may remember Cider's 1977 call to status action on behalf of the poor. Back then, God was on the side of the poor. The God of the Bible is on the side of the poor just because he is not biased, for he is a God of impartial justice. Page 84. What does he say now? Is God biased in favor of the poor? Is he on their side in a way that he is not on the side of the rich? Some theologians say yes, but until we clarify the meaning of the question, we cannot answer it correctly. Page 41. He has gone from confident rhetorical assertion to academic waffling. Chilton summarized Cider's policy recommendations, and he offered footnotes from rich Christians for every point: national, state, food policy, state-to-state foreign aid, and a guaranteed national income, international taxation, land reform, bureaucratically determined just prices, national health care, population control, and the right of developing nations to nationalize foreign holdings. In the 1997 edition, Cider mentions foreign and briefly in page 31 to 33. But even here, Cider favorably cites reports on how recipient governments have misused this aid in the past. Cider used the same kind of bureaucratic examples that Chilton used against his early editions in page 258 through 59. As for the recycled oil money loaned to the Third World in the 70s, Cider writes, too much of what was loaned was spent on armaments, ill-planned projects, or wasted because of official corruption. Page 154. Imagine that. Wasteful government. He still mentions land reform, but only briefly. Page 260. He wants lower tariffs against foreign products. He's adamant about this. Page 147 through 50 and 244 through 45. This was Chilton's suggestion years ago. Pages 101 through 103. As Cider has become more cautiously, openly so, he has dropped almost all traces of his previous toying with socialism and status coercion. The new edition is not the same book. It is not even a kissing cousin of the first 3 editions. His new edition is basically a retraction of the earlier editions, a kind of belated apology to the 350,000 buyers of his book, who bought intellectually damaged goods. Nevertheless, he still refuses to mention Chilton's book. Even in the bibliography, he reminds me of Winston Smith in Orwell's 1984, who dutifully dropped inconvenient historical information into the memory hole. Nevertheless, his new bibliography contains some very good books by such fine free market scholars as P.T. Barr, to whom Chilton dedicated the 3rd edition. Since Barr was a big fan of productive Christians, George Gilder, Brian Griffiths, Julian Simon, and Kyle Biesner. Unfortunately, he does not actually quote from any of these authors in 37 pages of headnotes, except to attack Bauer as an extremist, page 307. He quotes mainly from UNICEF, other United Nations agencies, and the World Bank. He still avoids citing economists generally and free market economists specifically, but at least his bibliography gives the illusion that he has thought through the reasons why his first 3 editions were wrong. Harbinger and Fad. Cider's book was part harbinger, part fad. It was a harbinger of things to come because in 1977, Protestant evangelicals were just barely coming back into American politics as an identifiable voting bloc. The presidential candidacy of Southern Baptist and Trilateral Commission member Jimmy Carter in 1976 had made acceptable the label evangelical in the political arena. White Southern Protestants actually voted against Carter, but hardly anyone recognized this in 1977 or even today. The pundits incorrectly attributed his victory to the unpredicted appearance of the evangelicals. From the era of the media-orchestrated humiliation of fundamentalist Christianity as the Scopes monkey trial in 1925 until the election of 1976, American evangelicals had been conspicuous by their absence. They generally opposed politics, or at least identifiably Christian participation in partisan politics. Roman Catholics did that sort of thing. It was widely believed, and you know what we think about Catholicism. For decades, political liberals who controlled the theologically liberal National Council of Churches had chided fundamentalists, calling on them to get out of their prayer closets and get active in politics. They got their wish answered in 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan, whose personal commitment to salvation through faith in Christ was never proclaimed by him in public, and by his defeat of Carter, whose public commitment to Christ was considered media-worthy, but whose personal commitment was to theologians such as Paul Tillich. The National Council crowd never knew what hit them. Reagan stood firm, at least rhetorically, against the NCC's version of the Eighth Commandment, thou shalt not steal except by majority vote. He was re-elected in 1984. The NCC has never recovered, like some emphysemic middle-aged athlete still dreaming of his glory days. The NCC continues to issue study guides and newsletters. No one pays any attention. After my evening debate with Sider at the Gordon Conwell Divinity School in 1981, a reporter asked me what I thought of Sider. I told him I appreciated Sider for softening up the market for my work. I told him that Sider was preparing the way for evangelicals to get involved in social action and politics, but that my economic opinions, not Sider's, were representative of the broad mass of evangelical opinion. That statement had been verified the previous fall with Reagan's defeat of Carter. Sider had been part of the minority of white evangelicals who were favorable to Carter's worldview and hostile to Reagan's. Sider's fame was based on the opinion of classroom professors and liberal arts editors, what I have referred to as the Wheaton College Christianity Today Calvin College Axis. This cloistered nonprofit community of liberal arts graduates is part of the modern chattering class, but it never has reflected the opinions of donors in the pews. The man in the pew always knew that socialism is simply communism for people without the testosterone to man the barricades. I have maintained for over 2 decades that neo-evangelicals pick up fads that have been discarded by secular liberals. Sider's book is proof. The tenured academic community of Christians was mildly socialistic when the American media were. Now they are mildly free market, just as the media are. What caused the damage? The failure of the Soviet Union. Mr. Gorbachev admitted in the late 1980s that his nation was economically bankrupt. This stunned the West's academics. They had always insisted that the USSR had a growing economy. Only a handful of free market economists had questioned this. By 1991, Gorbachev had been unceremoniously thrown out of power. So the communists. They had neither money nor power by August 21, 1991, the day the communist coup against Boris Yeltsin failed. With neither money nor power, communism fell out of favor in the West overnight. The secular humanist West worships money and power. Overnight, discount book bins filled up with Marxist books written by and for the college market. Marxists in the Western academic community found that their peers were laughing at them. Never before this happened. They'd always been taken seriously. Why? Because the communists had the power to terrorize people without threat of retaliation. And Western liberals have great respect for this degree of power. They have raged for decades, selectively, only against military dictatorships and small nations that might be overthrown. Now the impersonal forces of history, quote unquote, had turned against the communists. This was bad news for tenured professors who had publicly worshipped the forces of history. They rushed in panic, huffing and puffing, to get on board with the last train out of socialism's world of empty promises and emptier souls. They have now become born-again democratic capitalists. What is a democratic capitalist? Someone who has modified the Eighth Commandment as follows, quote, thou shalt not steal, quite as much as before, except by majority vote, unquote. That could affect neo-evangelicalism. Sider's book was partly a fad because it promoted a kind of warmed-over political liberalism that suited the times. Jimmy Carter had just been elected president of the United States. He was a political liberal, and he was a self-proclaimed evangelical, despite his commitment to neo-Orthodox theologians. 2 years later, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of Great Britain. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. Those two politicians restructured political rhetoric in the West. They made political conservatism acceptable. More important, they made liberals look both weak and silly. They oversaw major shifts in public opinion, even among intellectuals. In the year after Reagan's retirement, the Berlin Wall was torn down, and the East German troops did nothing to stop it, as if in response to Reagan's words to Mikhail Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Gorbachev sat tight. 2 years after that, he was thrown out of office, along with communism. Overnight, the liberation theology fad died. Marxism became passé, the ultimate humiliation in the modern intellectual world. This was the year after the third edition of Sider's book appeared, which sank without a trace. Reagan had destroyed the climate of opinion that had made Sider's book a bestseller among college-educated Christian evangelicals. Reagan had destroyed Sider's market surely as David Chilton had destroyed Sider's arguments. Sider admits as much. Communism has collapsed, expanding market economies and new technologies have reduced poverty. Democratic capitalism has won the major economic political debate of the 20th century. Communism, state ownership, and central planning have proven not to work. They are inefficient and totalitarian. Page 13 of the introduction. This was what David Chilton had argued back in 1981. Sider writes, one of the last things we needed was another ghastly Marxist-Leninist experiment in the world. Page 182 through 83. Yet in 1977, he offered this bold-faced, capitalized question, is God a Marxist? Page 72. He never answered this question. Instead, he wrote several pages on how God wreaks horrendous havoc on the rich. Page 77. Now he has answered his own question. This is progress. It took him only 20 years. The new, improved, and utterly boring version. Dr. Sider has admitted that he didn't understand much about economics in 1977. That was clear to Chilton and me when we finally got around to reading his book in 1980. Now he says he has changed. In his new book, for example, he continues to call for a graduated tithe, but he says this is strictly personal. He has not mentioned the state. Page 193 through 96. He assures us, quote, certainly it is not a biblical norm to be prescribed legalistically for others, unquote. Page 193. Throughout the book, he calls for private Christian charity, exactly what Chilton had called for. He makes a few gratuitous genuflections toward government intervention, but mainly in the most conventional areas, such as public health matters and education. Page 237. Activities that the typical Southern Baptist layman would agree with. Most revealing, he has stripped his book of confrontational rhetoric against the free market or in favor of big government. His rare negative rhetorical flourishes are now directed against Marxism. This edition is marked by academic caution. It is an apology rather than an apologetic, and it is boring. He knows this too. In one chapter on economics, he begins, however, the reader who has no interest in economics may want to skip to chapters 9 and 10, which deal with practical steps that individuals and churches can take to empower the people, page 138. After all, he finds economics boring and confusing, as the chapter reveals. Why shouldn't his readers feel the same way? Skip the economics if you like. Who needs it? Chilton's Bible-based economic arguments did not change Sider's mind. By the time communism fell, making anti-capitalism passe, he had written 2 revisions without even mentioning Chilton or other free market critics. Even now, in his 3rd revised edition, he has provided not one reference to Chilton's book, and not one to me or this commentary. The climate of opinion has not changed that much. It was not logic or the Bible that changed Roger Sider's mind. It was the change in the climate of secular academic opinion. He was not prepared to swim upstream. Neo-evangelicals always swim downstream with the liberal current, for liberals can impose academic sanctions. Sider's earlier editions were subtitled Biblical Study. He has now moved away from that sort of unacceptable positioning. He now writes, when the choice is communism or democratic capitalism, I support democratic government and market economics. Not quite. When the choice was between communism and market economics, he was not ready to attack Marxism, and he attacked the free market with a vengeance. It was only after the academic world was laughing at Marxists that he made his choice. He goes on to say, that does not mean, however, that the Bible prescribes either democracy or Marxists. To argue, as I have and Chilton did, that decentralized constitutional democracy and the free market are exactly what the Bible prescribes is too theonomic for Dr. Sider. Today, Ron Sider is closer to biblical truth, but not on the basis of the Bible. He dismisses a brief 1984 essay of mine defending the free market as little more than an extension of Adam Smith, whom he correctly identifies as an Enlightenment thinker, page 92, note 5. He refuses to tell his readers about my economic commentaries on my public attack on right-wing Enlightenment political theory and political polytheism, 1989. He has not mentioned theonomy's commitment to searching for judicially binding social blueprints in the Bible. He has not informed his readers that free market economics as a discipline began not with the Enlightenment, but with the late medieval scholastic school of Salamanca, a fact that I have tried to get people to understand ever since I published Murray Rothbard's article on the topic in 1975 in the Journal of Christian Reconstruction. These scholastics used rationalism, not the Bible, to defend their case. So did the late 17th century mercantilists. So did Smith. So is the entire economics profession. So what? Did he think his favorite economists in 1977? They were not many cited in his footnotes, and non-economists were not also heirs of the Enlightenment, as with his academic peers, and virtually the entire Christian world. He hates theonomy. Yet he implies that the Enlightenment left an unreliable legacy, to which I ask one more time, if not biblical law, then what? Sider has affirmed what of all his academic peers affirmed. The Bible offers no judicially binding economic, political, and social blueprints, but at least in this edition we find no traces of his original inflammatory anti-free market rhetoric, the outlook and rhetoric that made his book a bestseller. There also is no hint at the existence of some yet unpublished plan that might make statism work. He knows that statism will not work. He cannot tell us theoretically why this should be true. He shows no familiarity with Mises' 1920 article on the economic irrationality of social planning. This article was always the most important theoretical critique of socialism, which socialist economist Robert Heilbroner finally admitted in 1990 was correct. Anti-communism is pragmatic. If it is not based on economic theory or biblical law or some other moral ground, Sider now rejects communism as evil. Why did he wait so long? I contend that it was because the climate of secular liberal opinion had not shifted. Until secular pragmatists saw that communists could no longer maintain their terrorist apparatus, they rejected all economic criticisms of communism that were based on its inherently irrationality and or its moral evil. Until that historic turning point, the West's liberal media rejected all uncompromisingly anti-communist authors and opinions as biased and unscholarly, a fact spelled out in graphic detail by Jean-Francois Revel in his book, The Flight from Truth, The Reign of Deceit in the Age of Information, year 1988. How much civil government is appropriate? We do not know, Sider says. We need intensive study of how much and what kind of government activity promotes both political freedom and economic justice. Through painstaking analysis and careful experimentation, we must discover how much government can work with a basic free market framework to empower the poor and restrain those aspects of today's markets that are destructive. Page 236. Notice was the framework. Markets, not government. Guilt for poverty must now be shared internationally, perhaps like foreign aid, as we saw in Chapter 7. North Americans and Europeans are not to blame for all the poverty in the world today. Sin is not just a white European phenomenon. Page 228. But what are the effects of multinational corporations? For the purpose of this book, however, we do not have to know the answer to the question of their overall impact. Page 176. Some of them do damage, others do not. This is sociology's only known law. Some do, some don't. Well, of colonialism. It would be simplistic, of course, to suggest that the impact of colonialism and subsequent economic and political relations with industrialized nations was entirely negative. Among other things, literacy rates rose and health care improved. Page 135. This from the man who wrote in the second edition. It is now generally recognized by historians that the civilizations Europe discovered were not less developed or underdeveloped in any sense. Page 124 through 25. He goes on. It would be silly, of course, to depict colonialism as the sole cause of present poverty. Wrong personal choices, misguided cultural values, disasters, and inadequate technology all play a part. Page 136. They do indeed. Chilton's book in 1981. Well then, is there enough food being produced in the third world today? Is the third world facing famine? Here too, we just do not know. The World Bank says there's no threat. Lester Brown, whose pessimistic assessment was prominent in the 1977 edition, says there is a threat. The final verdict? Non-specialists like you and me cannot be sure. Here's what we can be sure of. This is not the rich Christians that sold 355,000 copies. Sider offers reworked versions of his old institutionalized evil and Jubilee year chapters, but his heart just isn't in it. Reading the 1997 edition of Rich Christians in the Age of Hunger is like going to your college class's 20th reunion and running into the campus radical who is there mainly to sing the old songs. He cannot remember half the words, but he can still hum most of the tunes. A good time will be had by all. It is a shame that David Chilton died a few weeks before the new version of Sider's book appeared. Because of the effects of his first heart attack, he could no longer remember most of what he had read, even his own books. I can imagine what he would have said about the 1997 edition. This is pretty sloppy theology, and its economics is really muddled, but it probably won't hurt anything. At least he calls for the tithe is morally binding. The good thing about the book is that people will not be able to remember anything unique about it. That will put them on my level. Still, I wonder who this guy Sider was. Conclusion. I have been hard on Ron Sider for 16 years. Had I read his book in 1977, I would have been hard on him for 20. Which Christians represent what I regard as the second worst aspect of neo-evangelicalism, its middle-class sellout to liberation theology. The worst aspect is its sellout to uniformitarian geology. Sider later went public with his opposition to abortion. He even called homosexuality immoral. Now he's begun to sound like a neoconservative, except for his reaction of the standard myths of environmentalism and his preference for cooperative farming instead of New York City's cultural delights. The book is not half bad. It is also not very good, but at least it seems harmless. Compared to the 1977 edition, it is a decent effort by someone who does not understand either economic theory or economic history, and who does not believe that biblical law is binding. For a man who rejects economic reasoning and biblical blueprints, what he proposes is not all that bad. Uninspiring, but not that bad. If he had published the version of the book in 1977, nobody would remember him today. If the book raises money for small business loans, the poor are fine, except for the matching funds offered such private lending agencies by government, as an apology to 350,000 people who, if they'd actually read those earlier editions after they bought them, were misled from cover to cover. The book is a step in the right direction. A long journey begins with a single step.